You can't get to a system like Auschwitz without what comes before it. This kind of mass detention that becomes more and more abusive over time. And even in the Nazi system, there was an existing concentration camp system with like Sachsenhausen and Dachau and many, many other camps for almost a decade before the death camps were added onto that pre-existing camp system. And so that root of abusive, punitive camps where there's often torture, usually mistreatment, most often people die of neglect and disease or malnutrition, but there is often active government involvement in doing harm as well. Some people have been already speaking about this fear about what's going to happen with all these detainees. If we can't get them deported quickly, the government is acting as if we'll be able to just send them wherever we want. And the Supreme Court is helping to make that possible. But a lot of countries are not going to be taking people back. And so when you have these large amounts of people in housing together, the temptation to then also have labor involved is going to be pretty high. And so I think historically we see in concentration camp settings that the longer and larger the detention project is, the greater the temptation to begin to use those detainees as forced labor.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, and today I'm really happy to be speaking to Andrea Pitzer. She's the author of 3 acclaimed books, The Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov and One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps, and most recently, Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World, which is the story of the Dutch navigator William Barents and his 1590s Arctic expeditions. Andrea matches meticulous historical research with immersive reporting from on the ground, on the sea, and on the ice. And she hosts the excellent podcast Next Comes What, and writes the newsletter Degenerate Art, both of which tackle many of the themes that we discussed on Rhyming Chaos. So she really is the perfect guest when it comes to the horrible and terrifying historical rhymes and parallels to our times and the would-be dictator in the White House. I'll try to make sure we have some fun despite talking about awful things. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Andrea.
Thank you. Strange to say, but delighted to be here. I'm the perfect guest for terrible times, I guess one could say.
The perfect guest for terrible times, yeah. An interesting guest, to paraphrase a apocryphal Chinese curse. So in One Long Night, you trace the evolution of concentration camps from their origins in Cuba and South Africa to the present day. What would you say are the key structural elements that define a concentration camp? And how do you distinguish between different types of mass detention facilities?
So in terms of that distinguishing between different types of facilities, I'll say one of the big challenges of my book, which I wrote twice as long as my publisher wanted to begin with, was having to cut so many sort of gray areas and borderline detention systems out. So most of my introduction in the book is swamped with things that are like camps, but I'm not including here because I don't have room. So ghetto type situations.
And it's a big book. I'm holding it in my hand.
It's a large book. And my publisher was willing to go twice as big, but not even further. Like, I'm grateful to them for even going for twice as much as they had originally asked for. So there are a lot of things that are kind of adjacent to camps. But when I'm defining concentration camps, looking again, in all these cases, my own research, but other people's as well. This is a world level trying to master a century of history on 6 continents, and no one person could be generating all that. But concentration camps are the mass detention of civilians without any real trial, usually on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation, some aspect of identity, rather than any kind of particular crime they've done, even though crimes are often sort of trumped up to be included. And so there's a couple important distinctions there. One is that we're not talking about prisoner of war camps, right? We're not talking about soldiers. We're talking about civilians. And when I talk about any real trial, that isn't to say that there's never a judge involved, but I'm thinking, for instance, with the British in Kenya, when Kenya was fighting for its independence after World War II, we had a judge that might wave a hand and sentence several people simultaneously, whole groups of people in a field, perhaps. Or in Soviet Russia, you might have a troika, a tribunal, a 3-person tribunal that would be reviewing cases and give out sentences. But typically they would give the same sentence to everyone for several days in a row. Then they might shift to something else. There's no defense presented. But in many cases in this kind of camp detention, you're talking about people who had no trial at all.
You argue that concentration camps often emerge during periods of perceived national crisis or threat. I wonder how you're looking at the current situation in the United States, because, as an immigrant, I didn't sense any crisis when I moved here. I thought this was a wonderful country in so many ways. And I certainly have never seen anything negative about immigrants, illegal or otherwise. How real is the sense of crisis? How much did Trump himself play a part in making the perception of a crisis?
So it's strange because there are kind of two key factors and trends that have happened here. And in one of them, unless you were tuned into the political arena or the target of all the sort of propaganda and advertising that has gone around in years, and many people are not at all in that world, you might miss entirely that there has been a decades-long, indeed a century-long campaign against the presence of immigrants in the U.S., and that both parties have had a serious hand in using immigration as a political issue to sort of score points. And to be clear, the Republicans are the driving force of the people that are demonizing immigrants in the U.S. today. But the Democrats have been afraid to sort of pick up and go home with that football and refuse to engage with immigration on that front. And so they tended to try to talk as tough or tougher than their political opponents. It tends to surge around election times. In the U.S., if you were here at that time, there was the talk that Trump did before of the caravan that was coming, which mysteriously, as soon as it wasn't politically necessary anymore, all discussion of it vanished. So it's this not actual ground level crisis related to immigration, not a real national crisis that's happening, but one that is very much ginned up. But you can't just gin it up overnight. And so Trump has relied on some pretty profound mistreatment and conditions in border detention for many, many years, legal decisions where the government has fought the court system when they've tried to guarantee due process and rights for immigrants. So this has been seeded for a long time. But make no mistake, Trump is the one that has turned this into a sort of a patriotic festival of hating immigrants, the idea that they're eating animals, the idea that they're criminals. It's creating a deliberate boogeyman that his followers can rally around. And I would say also that in some cases where camps have been developed and you see this kind of mass detention of civilians, there is actually some real national crisis happening. And it is either a botched attempt or a deliberately sort of Machiavellian attempt to seize control of the country by using that crisis that happens. In the U.S., I would say similar to Brexit, this is entirely manufactured, right? Immigrants are a tremendously positive part of the U.S. landscape. They are a critical part of the economy. They have been the very definition of the country since its birth. And yet it is a fault line in the U.S. that can be exploited for tremendous, tremendous harm.
I suppose there's a bunch of podcasters and media organizations that are delighted to terrify people because it gets clicks and bucks. What about using the word concentration camp in the United States now? I mean, some people are talking about immigration detention facilities as concentration camps. Is that a correct use of the word, do you think? And does it in any way minimize the severity of Nazi crimes?
And this is a question I always get. I'm glad you're asking it because I think it's really important to get to. When people hear the term concentration camp, almost everybody globally that has any awareness of 20th century history immediately thinks of Auschwitz. And they think of the death camps of Nazi Germany, and that it feels really inappropriate to compare anything else to those camps. And one of the key reasons I wrote my book was I wanted to understand, how did humanity get to that point? And so in terms of, if we're talking historical accuracy, so there's sort of two fronts, sort of public awareness and historical accuracy. But if we're talking historical accuracy, it is actually absolutely correct to use concentration camp on a number of different systems in a number of different countries over time, because you can't get to a system like Auschwitz without what comes before it. This kind of mass detention that becomes more and more abusive over time. And even in the Nazi system, there was an existing concentration camp system with like Sachsenhausen and Dachau and many, many other camps for almost a decade before the death camps were added onto that pre-existing camp system. And so that root of abusive, punitive camps where there's often torture, usually mistreatment, most often people die of neglect and disease or malnutrition, but there is often active government involvement in doing harm as well. There have been countless systems like that that have existed. So first of all, on this historical accuracy term, it's absolutely historically accurate to use that term. And in terms of people who talk to me and don't necessarily feel comfortable using it because they don't want to sound like they're calling what's happening Auschwitz, that I think everybody has to decide for themselves. For me, it's really critical to use that term. And I think for politicians, it's often really important too, for educators to understand that there's a pattern that happens. And right now, the U.S. is deep inside a recognizable following of that pattern, and that this is what we are currently doing, and that we're on the track to worse. But I'm not paid to make rules for other people. And I have encountered people who lost family in the Holocaust who don't want to use that term. And I would never pressure somebody to use it in that kind of situation. But I do think in my role in the public, it is critical for people to understand this history because almost nobody knows it. And it's how you get from point A to point Z when Z is Auschwitz. And let's say maybe we're at the letter LMNOP and we're headed in a bad direction. And so I do think awareness is critical for people to have on this fact.
So if we're at LMNOP, what does Q look like? What's next? Next comes what?
So unfortunately, the budget that was just passed in the U.S. is tilted horrifically, grotesquely, even in a sort of detention-happy carceral state that is America today. We really like our jails. We like to treat things punitively as a country, even in this country that we have, which has a lot of fantastic things about it as well. But the budget that just went through tilts toward the kind of detention that we have never had in the U.S. before. Immigrant detention, the money set aside for it, and to do border enforcement, to do deportations, that is on target right now to be the sort of largest detention aspect in America, to dwarf our current system, and certainly in terms of border detention, the most we've ever had, and that this very Trump-aligned law enforcement operation that encompasses the border folks and the ICE folks. I mean, there's a few different groups organized here, but together they will be the largest law enforcement operation in the country. And so what's coming is QRS. And because they are so Trump aligned, this is one of the critical things we see where the party leader or the executive in a rising authoritarian state has a police force at their disposal that can broadly go against targeted groups in ways that politically benefit the leader. And recently in Washington, D.C., we are hearing of big plans for moving against homeless people in the nation's capital. And historically in Europe, Nazi Germany is one of the examples. There is a big move against unhoused people and vagrants, what I often refer to as vagrants on the street, especially back in the 1930s. They were called that. You see big moves against that population when you are wanting to expand the groups of people that you can detain and move from your more obvious targets to targets that are harder to touch for now. And I think homelessness in America is endemic enough that it will, in this case, also serve as a bridge from groups that everybody has kind of agreed, okay, we're going to lock some of these people up, like immigrants. Most people would agree you want to lock up bad immigrants and deport them, the ones that commit murder, the ones that commit violent crimes. Even Americans that see themselves as fairly liberal would support that. But as you move into this grayer area of homelessness, where you're not even really charging people with a crime, you're making it illegal to exist without a house, right? You're making it illegal to be on the street overnight, to sleep somewhere. And sometimes even in the absence of those kinds of statutes, you see governments start to treat homelessness this way. So that's sort of what I see coming next is an expansion of who gets detained.
Right. And how about the business side of it? Because it strikes me that companies like the ominously named Core Civic, which used to be American Correctional Corporation, are going to make a lot of money in the business of detaining and shipping people. How does this compare with Nazi Germany or other concentration camp systems, the involvement of private enterprise?
Private enterprise is almost always involved in some key way. You see it particularly in European fascist movements because this corporatism and the ties with business and government, like that's a piece of that political ideology. But you see it in several shadow forms that followed, let's say, in Central and South America in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s even, where you end up with a government that becomes extremely, let's say, anti-union, anti-worker, and then the businesses aligning with them. And then the businesses stand to profit in tremendous ways. And to go back to that budget that we talked about just a second ago that the U.S. has passed, now you are seeing in the calls for proposals that have been put out, the solicitations, which are on a publicly available site, you can look at them, and I go do sometimes, you can see it is tremendous amounts of money. More than $1 billion, $500 million. And some of these contracts are being given to companies that have little or no background in these arenas. Others are going to some of, as you mentioned, and there's a half dozen huge ones that have tremendous experience and will be expanding on it. The money is so tremendous that you see the pull on groups that are like rock concert planners, but they're event planners, right? And you see them now bidding on some of these things. You can see the actual shift of the economy toward this detention on a national scale. But I think the real endemic danger here, and we see it in history and other places, is what happens on the local scale, right? What happens when a small town becomes dependent on the beds being filled and that detention center being filled. And many places in rural America have really been left on their own, and there may not be good jobs. There may not be prospects of employment. Some of these places have been ravaged by the opioid epidemic and continue to be. And to have a job as a guard, to have a job in administration in one of these facilities, especially when you see some of the offers coming through. I think one of the ones for ICE is talking about loan forgiveness. And this is exactly what the Congress denied and the courts denied Biden being able to do in the last administration, but they're going to offer it preferentially. So what you end up with in this situation is you end up with a state that is run on corruption, that's run on favoritism, that's run on deals that happen between business and government and not by the processes that have been set up sort of in more democratic societies. That's something that was tremendous in Nazi Germany. Hitler and people underneath him gave out all kinds of concessions, all kinds of bribes. You also saw, even at Auschwitz, for anyone who knows, some people have been already speaking about this fear about what's going to happen with all these detainees. If we can't get them deported quickly, the government is acting as if we'll be able to just send them wherever we want. And the Supreme Court is helping to make that possible. But a lot of countries are not going to be taking people back. And so when you have these large amounts of people in housing together, the temptation to then also have labor involved is going to be pretty high.
And there's going to be a shortage of labor on farms and construction sites, isn't there? So the opportunities for a company that can use forced labor could be very big.
And so I think historically we see in concentration camp settings that the longer and larger the detention project is, the greater the temptation to begin to use those detainees as forced labor. And it's something that has happened in many different kinds of camps, from the Soviet Gulag to, again, those colonial camps where imperial powers were fighting against liberation movements, thinking mostly 50s and 60s in Africa and Asia, Southeast Asia, and certainly China. To go to your background, I mean, forced labor became a tremendous thing. It's even the principle of a lot of the Soviet model and the Chinese model was this idea of reforming thought or reforming the self or reforming one's political identity through education, and especially education through labor. And so the fact that so many systems have gone in that direction, I think, should make us very concerned about what's going to happen in the U.S.
No, absolutely. I mean, there was some right-wing politician tweeting the other day a photo of the famous gate to Auschwitz with the Arbeit macht frei, the work labor makes you free, and saying, we don't have a labor problem, making a joke about this.
No, but this is one of the things that we see that's different now, because you were saying sort of what's the same and what's different. And what I would say is, of course, we don't have death camps at this point in time. But we are already seeing horrific conditions in the Everglades. We're talking about maggots in food, lack of access to food and water. These are classic parts of concentration camp history, that these things began even when there's not necessarily intentionality. But on top of that, we are seeing politicians actively embracing, like Auschwitz, as you said. We are seeing these people literally embracing some of the worst moments from this history. And to think that reasonable heads are going to prevail and that no one will actually do the worst things that have happened, I think would be really naive. It's going to take time to get to those worst stances that can happen and worst situations that can happen in terms of gassing and showers and the nightmare things people imagine when they hear the words concentration camp. But we are setting ourselves on a path where it's part of a larger thing that happens in a society. And these things just start to fit with the goals of leaders who are like this. They start to fit in a society that is vulnerable to giving into this kind of crisis, that's this imaginary crisis. And so there isn't just going to be a light switch we turn off and then we just kind of go back to, okay, we're not doing that anymore, right? We have to be aware that we are on a path, we are on an arc, that we're going to have to do serious intervention to not end up giving into sort of those political words, just the rhetoric of like that guy the other day flying around. Those lay seeds, they really do plant seeds over time. And so I think people need to be paying attention.
Yeah. In your book, you examine how bureaucratic structures and legal frameworks enable mass detention. What do you think in the United States, what are the institutional mechanisms that have allowed the U.S. immigration detention system to operate with relatively little public scrutiny?
Well, I mean, I won't go through the whole story, but it really goes back 100 years, because before 100 years ago, outside of Chinese immigrants and Chinese American, really Asian immigrants, Asian Americans, a lot of different populations could come and go from the U.S. It was simple. There was no barrier to it. That was not the truth with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And certainly people coming in from the West Coast were treated very, very differently. And that approach was institutionalized for most what were seen as undesirable immigrant groups about 100 years ago. And people were categorized. And of course, the language on this was done more subtly, but it was a real attempt to keep Jewish people out that might be seen as revolutionaries coming into the country. It was an attempt to keep people of color out, particularly dark-skinned people. And so immigration quotas, immigration restrictions were set up, but I won't go through the whole century of it. So we'll just go into recent years. The bureaucracy of it is such that we have made it impossible. If you talk to anybody who actually works in the field of immigration, we have made it almost impossible to do straightforward immigration on a legal path. And you may have even your own stories in this regard, or maybe you came in on a visa that was particularly helpful. But for somebody who is willing to come here and do hard work and wants to come legally, that process is extremely, extremely difficult, usually involves years and years of waiting. And people have been punitively treated in the meantime for all that. So we've made it almost an unjumpable hurdle for most people that want to come to the U.S. First of all, that's a big bureaucracy thing. And then the second thing, particularly what we're doing right now, we are punishing the people that are doing exactly what we told them. We are punishing the people that are showing up for immigration hearings. We are punishing the people that are showing up for green card hearings. We are arresting them. Sometimes when they are willing voluntarily to go, we are detaining them anyway and prolonging that process. There are any numbers of ways in which we are bending the machinery of already a broken immigration system to make it more punitive and more horrifying, as we see with the return of the active engagement and encouragement of family separations, which were enough to horrify the world just a few years ago. And now it's just one more thing in this mix of things. But we've got masked people on the streets. And that is now, again, with this budget and with what the courts have done, particularly since Trump returned to office, but especially, in the last 10 years overall, but especially since Trump's return to office, we are seeing the institutionalization of that. And I went to Guantanamo twice for my book, and I gave it an important role in the book that I wrote because I saw it as sort of this open wound on our democracy that was festering there for 2 decades. It's been more than 2 decades now. And that is a case where the government went with something, and again, Democratic and Republican presidents alike used Guantanamo for immigration purposes, mass detention, tens of thousands of people, when it was convenient politically to not have to deal with those people arriving in Florida. But by having something in this gray zone where it's under U.S. control, but not quite U.S. soil. So there's a question of what legal protections are going to be afforded to the people there. And then battling that out in courts, part of what that's done over the last 20 years is institutionalize that gray area and expand it. And now it's really similar kinds of gray area for anything along the border, which is a shocking amount of terrain when you look at what's legally allowed to be handled. And it's not an accident that one of the first things Trump wanted to do was send more people to Gitmo. I think we're seeing the institutionalization of the Gitmo approach that is now coming into the country and being used as widely as it can be.
You also document in your book both collaboration and resistance to concentration camps. What forms of resistance do you think are most crucial for addressing the current American crisis?
I would say that what became apparent looking over time at these different places, because many of them had very different legal systems, right? Some were democracy, some were communist states, some were revolutionary states, some were ad hoc states. So there's a lot of responses that happened. But the theme that came out was that you want to keep at least as much of an independent judiciary as you can. And it doesn't mean that the whole thing is uncorrupt and is solid and can do its work perfectly. But even a semi-functioning, semi-independent judicial system is a huge win because it drags things out, because it keeps things in the public eye, because it creates a public record, and because sometimes those cases will rise either legally or politically or through public awareness to actually making a difference and reversing some of those changes. So the first leg of it would be keep as much of an independent judicial system as you can. And the second thing is actually the right of dissent. And I hear a lot of people talking about, well, what good does all this protest do? And Erica Chenoweth at Harvard just published some new stats today that we are now at almost, I think, not quite 4 times as much, but just below 4 times as much protest as there was during the first Trump administration at this same point. We now have more than almost 4 times that much. And I think it's just incredible that people are coming out. And it might seem like protest itself is not doing a lot, but preserving that ability to publicly oppose the government is often a key step in the long run of how you can eventually undo this trend.
So doing as much as possible to ensure that there remains an independent judiciary and actual protesting on the street. Those are the 2 key things.
Those are the 2 theme things, but I can say specific stuff, if you'd like, for your audience that they can be doing.
I think I would because, one of the reasons I started the show is I, like a lot of people who value freedom and democracy in the United States, we just feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. What kind of concrete actions do you recommend?
Okay, so there's a long list. I'll make a short one, but you can also, if you go to my site, Next Comes What or Degenerate Art, either one. The podcast is Next Comes What and the newsletter is Degenerate Art. Every Tuesday, I do a post that ends with specific things that people can do. But some of those things thematically are, in terms of that judicial aspect that I talked about, you can help make sure in your city, town, county, state, that whatever immigrant organizations are helping people get representation and have a lawyer in court when they are brought for any kinds of charges, or if they're facing deportation hearings, if you have a lawyer, you are much, much more likely to be able to stay in the country or be with your family while things are being litigated. So that's crucial. Anything that helps bring cases through. So ACLU, different immigrant aid organizations, whether you help with material aid, mutual aid, food pantries for those families that are affected, that's all huge. And that actually plays to that judicial end. And you can also, and you should also find out what ICE is doing in your community, because most people don't know. And we live in a segregated enough society that a lot of people, if they aren't part of the communities that are targeted, they may not see how much is really happening. And it's a lot. And if you find out from your elected representative, you can contact your local law enforcement yourself or talk to people who are representing those in the legal system right now who are caught up in it. So you could talk to those immigrant aid organizations yourself and find out what is ICE doing. And then you talk to your local representatives. So city councils, county councils, state representatives, and you work on getting ICE out. And I have one whole episode that is literally just on how do you get ICE out of your community. And there's a tremendous map that's linked to there that shows the level and kind of cooperation for every county in America. You should contact your national representatives, absolutely. But as you said, people look at this national trend and they feel really overwhelmed and they feel helpless. And the answer is there's so much you can do on the ground close to home. It isn't your job to solve the whole thing. And if you try to think of it as you have to reverse decades of immigration abuse and undo the Republican Party's damage, like you're never going to do anything, because who could do all that? And the answer is that's not going to be what you need to do. But doing something close to home, even if it's just starting out, showing up at some demonstrations and protests, you're going to meet people that are involved in things. You're going to start to understand the lay of the land on what's happening, and you'll find places to plug in. That might be through a church, that might be through a library, anything that is helping educate people about what's going on, learning the Know Your Rights pamphlet information, and being involved in ICE Watch in your community, where people who are citizens can go out and report this stuff, where they're not going to be at risk of being arrested and detained. And then you let people know where ICE is active on any given night, and people can check in if they need to know if they can leave the house. You can be part of local efforts in a million ways.
That's very informative. I'll put links to the web pages that you referred to in the show notes so people can go and check out the details themselves. How do you feel about the way the news media has handled the second Trump presidency?
This just really goes to the core. I guess, I don't know who I am or my perspective that's informed by my research. I'm not sure what it is, but all the time people are like, you seem weirdly optimistic for somebody who's telling us how terrible everything is. And the truth is that, as you know, I'm sure from the studying that you've done and the research that you've conducted yourself, we in the US, we have way more freedom and options as a whole, as a population, than almost any of the places I've studied that have gotten this far along with this level of detention. And so we actually have so many ways to respond. And people in those other places and other times actually found ways to resist too, when they were much, much more constrained. And so I'm definitely wow, we're in danger and there's a lot we can do. And I would say my perspective on the media extends in a similar way to say, I think we're really screwing up. And I say this as a journalist. I think we're really screwing up coverage of the second Trump administration. And there are amazing outlets that are doing incredible work. And to divide those unfairly and with huge generalizations into two categories, I would say that the journalism and media coverage of the president as a whole, and particularly of Trump and this administration, that we have seen from legacy media, particularly large TV networks, and especially legacy newspapers, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, we have seen all the vulnerabilities of the prior system playing out before our eyes in the ways that a lot of those organizations, even as they still have reporters doing really good work, are fundamentally, as institutions, unable to grapple with what's happening. Because what allowed somebody like Trump to take hold in the Republican Party and then to take hold in the country itself and ultimately take over the country is the same reason that the papers aren't able to cover him, because he fills a void of how things work for them that in their past, they only know how to deal with institutionally, that they're institutional equals kind of speaking important person to important person, right? And so Trump gives them a role to play by being outrageous, and they kind of fall into that and they can't escape it because they can't really imagine, even despite the Judith Miller example during the Iraq War, for instance, they really can't imagine that they're just being played, that they're just being used, and that to fall into this kind of neutral rhetoric on these really alarming actions is absolutely furthering Trump's role. But that said, I will say there's an amazing amount of independent and small outlet coverage, often even from individuals, Marisa Kabas, Chris Geidner on the Supreme Court, but you see Bolts, you see Flaming Hydra, you see just all these people creating little collectives or individually doing just phenomenal work. Wired, 404 Media. I mean, I could go on all day. I could name a dozen easily, and I'm trying to subscribe to as many as possible. And I will put in a good word for the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is kind of holding on by the skin of its teeth and is doing some really good stuff too. But I think we are both failing and doing impressive work at the same time as journalists.
Do you think that there's a particular weakness of American news media culture in that the idea of presenting both sides fairly is almost taught as an article of faith in American news journalism? It's not quite the same in other parts of the world. I don't think there's any other country where journalists will proudly tell you they don't vote because they want to be non-partisan. But that seems to me to make American journalism much more vulnerable to somebody like Trump, because there's this constant need to display that you're being even-handed, and you can't cope with somebody like Trump with that attitude. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. I was just talking with my husband about this earlier today, about something similar, which is I think that it's a little bit the same thing as the discussion about gerrymandering right now, which is if the Democrats stay neutral on it and the Republicans are willing to do it in Republican-run states, then the Republicans win the House, right? This is just by definition. If you have one that says we're going to stick with our independent, objective boards that were set up to keep this kind of political machinations from happening, then if you can dismantle enough of the system on one side, and think about this too, like as Murdoch bringing Fox News into the US, right? If everybody else is playing by that objective kind of rule, and you can create one behemoth that is tilted very far the other way, but still borrows just enough language of that it can sort of not be completely kicked out of that ecosystem, even if it's a sort of a disgraced member, you're tilting the whole ecosystem. If you have somebody with enough money to come in and Bigfoot a system, then you can make that work. And I would say that it's a particular weakness of American journalism, but having grown up in that system, it also had its advantages and its usefulness for a long time. And so what I would say is, this is what we see with concentration camp history again and again, the systems that it comes into, they rely on, so you have this international trend of these kinds of camps, but at the same time, they take root in a local system and they take advantage of that local domestic country that they're inhabiting. So I would say like England, for instance, has a very different approach to journalism, and yet it has its own different vulnerabilities, right? So every system has its vulnerabilities, but I think you've hit on the biggest one for the US, which is that institutional papers and broadcasters had no way to address that because they were presenting themselves as the grown-ups in the room, talking to the grown-ups in government, and they were very reasonable people. And of course, if something were monstrous, they wouldn't be in this dialogue as a reasonable adult with another reasonable adult. And therefore, they just, by default, give a veneer of reasonableness to that partner, no matter who it is, right? Literally, we have insane, and I don't mean that disrespectfully at all to people with mental health issues. We have perverse and horrific headlines coming out every day from the New York Times because it has to institutionally, what is happening in DC has to be framed in the tradition of how the Times frames things. And as soon as you do that, you can't help but legitimize what's going on, even when it's not your intent. But what you've hit on was the big vulnerability for corrupting the U.S. information system. But along with that, I would say the end of like having real coverage of both sides, the fairness doctrine, when that was abandoned in the U.S., that was also huge. And when you saw media conglomeration, that was huge. And when you saw massive influx of money to Rush Limbaugh style right-wing radio and to Fox News, those were three other really critical pillars to get us to where we are today.
Right. And then there's the internet too, I guess, which has been very good at making people very angry about stuff.
Well, the outrage bait that you talked about, yeah, but also the thing about the internet, and I just wrote this week about, some people say you don't have to look to concentration camps and fascist history in Europe to address what's coming here in America, because we have genocide and slavery and Jim Crow. There's been this thread that's been a persistent part of American history that is sufficient to explain it. But what I talked about in my thing was that you need both, because we are definitely, with the Arbeit macht frei that you see this California legislator posting, we are in conversation with the world, right? And particularly with the internet, you see all of this accelerating. We can even go back to Hitler, since we're on a Nazi theme, although again, there's so many camps all over the world that were different, but that's the one people are familiar with, so I often talk about it. Hitler took inspiration from American eugenics early on and from Indian removal and Native American genocide, literally aped parts of his policies based on things that had happened or science that was promoted in the U.S., which isn't to say the U.S. was entirely to blame for those things that he did. He was looking for a tool, right? But that borrowing of tools back and forth is something that's been going on a very long time. And the internet has absolutely connected those white supremacist groups to anti-minority groups in other places, to anti-immigrant groups, to religious extremists. All over the world, you have Hindu extremists meeting with, compound dwellers here in the U.S. and talking to unreconstructed fascists in South America. And once you have this kind of dialogue, you can compare notes on propaganda. You can actually be fueling things. And the U.S. has a long history of helping to fuel these kinds of things around the world. But now you don't even need a government to be involved, right? These people can do it on their own. And when you put the weight of a government behind it, as we saw with Myanmar on Facebook, it has huge effects. So the internet has definitely amplified it and speeded up what's going on.
One last question, Andrea. Tell me about, and it might be a long answer, tell me how One Long Night fits into your Zambler trilogy. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I can explain what I mean. We'll see if it makes sense. But all my answers are long, so this one will be a long one as well. So it's a strange one, though. I got caught up in some Nabokov research. I had a chance to take classes in around 2008. I wanted to take an English class, was one of the things I wanted to do. And I wanted to do it for somebody I had not read extensively, that I had read some of, but I would probably not read their whole opus, body of work on my own. And Nabokov was the person I chose. And I became literally obsessed. And I sort of ended up writing about Nabokov as a journalist. So I got FBI files on people in his family, on people who were affiliated with his family. I found networks of some Nazis that his sister-in-law was involved with that nobody had realized, but also something that had been covered but hadn't really been tied into him before was his cousin's role in the CCF, which was a CIA cultural front group. And basically, I just pursued all the ways that Nabokov's century, which involved fleeing his dad was put in jail by the Russian Tsar and then by Lenin, and then they fled Russia, and then they were in Germany. His dad was assassinated there, and Hitler came to power just after he married a Jewish woman and had a child with her. And so then they ended up leaving Germany, and they were in France, and they had to flee France. As France was falling, they were one of the last boats that got away. And so I think people thought of him as a guy who wrote dirty books about, preteen girls if they didn't know his work well. Obviously, serious people don't think of him that way, but many people only knew him from Lolita. And I wanted to write the story of how all the stuff in his novels had been missed. All this historical stuff that he had lived through had actually played an important part. And one of those pieces was that his younger brother, not much younger at all, Sergei, had actually died. He was a gay man, and he had died in a German concentration camp. And he had died just months before the end of the war. Any death there is tragic, but to think how close he was to maybe surviving is just heartbreaking. So I went to Neuengamme, which is where he died, in northern Germany, not far from Hamburg. And I spent some time in the archives there. Again, this was for the Nabokov book. And camps came up in many of his books, both the World War I camps, which was really the first I had thought about them as a global camp system, but also, of course, Nazi camps, but from his own background in Russia, Soviet Gulag. And it came to me like, how did concentration camps come into the world? I had this question that I couldn't quite answer. And so I looked around, and there was literally no book that answered that question. There were many people who were experts on the Nazi system, on the Soviet system. Some people had spent one camp as the focus of maybe a 30-year career. But I had not seen a comprehensive study. There were a couple good papers that looked at sort of colonial origins in the late 19th century when imperial powers started rounding up usually peasant populations, not always, but when it was some kind of a war setting. But these were civilians they rounded up. But there was no thing that said, how did this come into the world and how did we get to Auschwitz? And so I was the least qualified person probably to write that project, but I spent several years doing it. I sold it to a publisher as a proposal. And so it's amusing to me when some people attack me as being just like anti-Trump or having Trump derangement syndrome, because I pitched and sold this book, the camps book, before Trump ever even announced that he was running. And I wrote all but 1 month of my year's work on it was completed. All but one of those months, that time was completed before Trump had even won the election. And so I saw this as a gap that needed to be filled. In some ways, this was the advantage of being a journalist, because for academia, they want you to go very deep and very narrow. But I wanted to tell this story that was broad and wide. And I'm really glad I did, because now so many academics are doing comparative work, and not singly because of what I did, but I think it freed up a public kind of discourse that they could point to and say, look, this is being discussed widely. We need to do more of it. And now the people who are truly experts on, let's say, they know 20 years of detention in Myanmar, they are in conversation with people who are in other parts of the globe, which is not to say that they were never talking before, but I think it's just a little bit easier to do it now. And so I'm so happy that book, it didn't sell a lot, but that it was useful in that context. And now I hope it's useful to people in this current context. And then the book also led to my third book. And there was a part of me, honestly, it was so hard to go all over the world. I went into Rohingya camps, in Myanmar, had machine guns pointed at me. I was never in serious danger, I don't think, but it was uncomfortable work. But the hardest part of it was that I did talk with people either who had had their whole families and their lives shattered by torture or death in camps, or I spoke to people who were still alive and in them. And I also spoke, in some cases, to people who had been or were currently guards in these places at Guantanamo, in Myanmar, and how they rationalized what they were doing. It was all very psychologically challenging and painful. And so for my last book, my most recent book, part of what I thought about was what's in it just as important an idea that doesn't require quite so much grueling in doing that, because I need something that's a little different. And so I ended up writing an Arctic story with the goal of switching to covering climate issues to try to really address the climate catastrophe. And so to kind of get myself onto that path, I started with something that had come up in one of Nabokov's novels, and it was in Pale Fire, in which the mad narrator believes he is the exiled king of a northern land called Zembla. And there's an actual Nova Zembla, Novaya Zemlya in Russian, and it's just north and a little bit west of the Siberian part of the mainland. And there was a Dutch crew that was lost there and stranded 400 years ago in the time of Shakespeare. And I discovered the story about them, and it's how the Barents Sea was named, if you've ever heard of the Barents Sea. And I discovered them through researching everything about the history of Zembla, as Nabokov might have construed it for his novel. And I found this story fascinating. And so it led me on 3 Arctic expeditions, and I went to the ruins of the cabin north of Siberia and have since gone back and learned to be a sailor and do cold water diving and spoken Russian, which I hadn't known at all, even when I wrote the Nabokov book, which is a little embarrassing to admit. So at any rate, I blame Nabokov for all 3 of my books, and that's why I call them the Zembla trilogy.
Okay, wow, that's really fascinating. Let me ask you actually a last question. What would Nabokov make of Trump's America?
It's a little bit hard to say, because Nabokov is a really great case study. He was absolutely, in his mind, against tyranny. He wrote very much having come of age in the era in which you did not need passports, and then early in his adulthood, having seen that shift in America being pretty terrible, along with Europe, which was even worse in that moment, in terms of dealing with immigrants and people who were refugees from Nazi Germany, not able to work, not able to get into the country. He wrote against the papers, please mentality, as he called it, and the apparatchiks of government that would punish and enjoyed punishing people who were in extremis. On the one hand, he himself was a refugee into Germany, a refugee into France, and then a refugee into the US, and suffered quite a bit in those years. On the other hand, once he was here, he was, of course, very anti-communist, having fled he actually fled Russia before it became Soviet Russia, but became a staunch opponent of Soviet Russia to a degree that his bedfellows in the U.S. were people like William F. Buckley. And he became a very staunch anti-communist in the way we think of Cold Warriors as staunch anti-communist, with some of the blindnesses of that. He was very much against New York City protests. He was very much against ungrateful Americans who didn't realize how good they had it. I would like to think that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the rise of someone like Trump, who he would see as vulgar and grotesque and an idiot, that he would be very much against him, and it would maybe let him see some of the ways in which his own arguments against protesters, against other things, had not been as sound as he maybe thought. But I think that he, like everybody else, I think if something appeals to your own fears and anxieties, it can be easy to fall for things. And that's what we're seeing in the US right now. And so part of the project of getting out there and letting everybody know what's happening is an attempt for people to understand what's really taking place. And I think most Americans, and I'd like to think Nabokov too, once they would see what's actually really happening on the ground, would say this is not an America that I think should exist.
On that note, thank you very much, Andrea. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yinfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you for having me on, Jeremy.